Hi, Frank. Thank you very much for joining us today. You have a very solid background when it comes both to regulatory matters and rare diseases. So could you just please tell us a bit about that background?
Yeah, sure, Charlotte. It turns out I was at FDA when the Orphan Drug Act became law in the United States. And everybody at the FDA thought it was going to be enormously impactful, but it wasn't. So the FDA commissioner asked me personally to investigate this, to research it, to find out why it wasn't having the impact that everyone anticipated it would. So my research then led to the 1984 and the 1985 amendments to that 1983 law, and that made the law work. And so then I was asked to draft the implementing regulations so that sponsors and patients could understand how to use it in the way that the FDA was going to implement it. And then after that, I left the FDA as Deputy Director of Health Policy in the Commissioner's Office in 1987, went to the law firm where I am today, still 33 years later. And what I've been doing for those 33 years is helping sponsors and patients understand the U.S. orphan drug laws and to help them navigate them so we can get new therapies out to our sisters and brothers who are afflicted with rare conditions.
Very impressive background, I must say.
I guess, Charlotte, I'm sorry for interrupting. I guess I should say when I left, I also went to the organization that was the organization that championed the Orphan Drug Act in the United States, called the National Organization for Rare Disorders, or NORD. And I became its chairman, and I was on its board for 16 years. I wrote the bylaws, which said you can only be elected to 2 consecutive 3-year terms, so a maximum of 6 years. So at year 7, I said, I have to leave. I'm a lawyer. I wrote the bylaws. And they said, no, we have to grandfather you in. You have to stay. I did that for a decade, for 10 years. And then I said, no, I'm stepping down. And as soon as I stepped down, then another organization that represents patients with rare diseases, the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, asked me to join as its vice chairman of its board. So that's where I am today. And while at NORD, NORD also did me the great honor of giving me its first ever Lifetime Achievement Award. It should have gone to others, not me. But I say that only so that you know that, yeah, I have had, as you say, a long involvement with helping all of our sisters and brothers who have rare conditions.
Frank, I'm amazed. I was impressed even before you took the other half and rest of that. When you were at the FDA, as you said, you both implemented and updated the Orphan Drug Act. And I'll pose a leading question here. Would you say there are any advantages for mitochondrial diseases in that act?
Yes. In fact, the original author of that law, this might be more information than your audience wants to know, but the original author, Congressman Henry Waxman, well known in the United States, that when he wrote his book later, cataloging all of his lifetime achievements as a well-known legislator in the U.S. Congress, the Clean Water Act and the Orphan Drug Act were his 2 most important achievements. But when he wrote the Orphan Drug Act, he thought that tax credits would be the number 1 incentive so that a company like Abliva or companies pursuing mitochondrial disease would be looking for tax credits, U.S. tax credits, to incentivize them to invest in therapies for rare diseases, rare mitochondrial diseases. But it didn't work out that way. It turns out that what became the real incentive was a period of 7 years of monopoly pricing. That for 7 years, the U.S. government would enforce a monopoly and would prevent others from also developing the same therapy for the same condition. So that 7 years of government-enforced monopoly was a huge incentive for people to pour in to the orphan drug field, like for mitochondrial diseases. In fact, there had been a commission set up before this law that was sponsored by the drug industry. In those days, it was called PMA. Today in the United States, it's called PhRMA, the big trade association. And they set up the PMA Commission on Drugs of Limited Commercial Significance. That was the title of the report they came out with, because they were concerned that people with rare diseases like mitochondrial diseases that are very serious had no one paying any attention to them, not doing any research in their areas. And so they, as an industry, were concerned. And that report kind of summarizes how little there was in this field until the Orphan Drug Act. And then the Orphan Drug Act came along. It created this monopoly. And I think that monopoly pricing said that you as a sponsor, as an industry developer of a rare disease for mitochondrial disease, don't have to depend upon your patent protections that you have to then go out and vigorously enforce by finding someone who might be violating your patent, bringing them to the court. And there's always uncertainty whenever you go into court as whether you'll be successful. Here it was, the government was going to become your shield against other competitors. So it was a great incentive. So I hope that explains why I think now we have so many companies like Abliva and many others, even in the mitochondrial field, investing in trying to find therapies that will alleviate the suffering of our sisters and brothers with these conditions.
That's very interesting to hear. I mean, it's very, very uncommon that a government supports a monopoly in that way. So it's very interesting, that history. Now, in your current role as an advisor, do you have any advice to a company like Abliva when talking to the government in these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, Charlotte. Thank you. That, you know what, a lot of times people in industry kind of view the regulators, and I'm sure this is the same thing with your Swedish national regulatory authorities or with the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, that people view national regulatory authorities like the FDA as the enemy, as somebody who is denying you an opportunity to bring your therapy to the benefit of patients who are in need of having therapy. I think that the advice that I would distill from my decades of working in this field is that you have to look at it from the perspective of they are out to try to advance the public health as well, but they have a different perspective. So try to view them as someone who has a different responsibility but has the same objective as you. You're really joined at the hip. It's really a three-part collaboration. It's, first of all, patients. Second, it's the industry who's getting investors who are coming to develop the therapies, maybe developed by academics. And then third, it's the national regulatory authorities like the FDA. So I think that if you view this as a three-legged stool, that each part is important to the process. And the thing I have to say, because there might be patients listening today, is that the U.S., we had drug laws going back to 1906, so over 100 years. Those drug laws never included the word patient. They never included the word patient until 2012, because it was viewed that the patient was somebody who was going to be the person who would receive the benefit of all the research and all the activities that were being done by industry together with investigators, key opinion leaders who understood the diseases, as well as the national regulatory authorities. But the patient had no role except to be the recipient of all of this activity. And I have helped champion a change in attitude so that I put the patient in the process. The patient's voice is essential. And so now I'm kind of diverging from your question a little bit to encourage any who are listening, who are patients or families of patients, to go out and get involved, to go out and see whoever is treating you as a specialist, encourage them to sign up to be part of a natural history or a registry so that your information can begin to be part of the pool of information which will help drive innovation in your therapy. You are part of the process that's going to help heal you, and take control and assert your voice, because your voice is essential.
Thank you, Frank. I think that's a very important perspective. And in Sweden, I think we have a lot of that history of having the patient in the middle and the patient perspective. I have another question. You touched upon this before. There are a lot of regulatory benefits for orphan drugs, and you touched upon the answer, but have they worked?
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, yeah, the history is something like, in the 10 years before the Orphan Drug Act, there were something like 2 or 3 therapies that were approved by the US FDA for people with rare conditions. In the decade after the Orphan Drug Act, there probably were 50 to 100. And today there are something like 700, therapies that have been approved by the US FDA for people with rare diseases. So we have this colloquial expression in the United States that the proof is in the pudding, meaning you tell the results by looking at what you have in front of you. And what we have in front of us today is an achievement for sure, but it's not nearly enough, because there are 7,000 rare diseases. That means that we only have therapies for maybe 10% of all of the rare diseases that exist. We have much, much more work to do.
There's a lot more work to do, but I'm encouraged about what you said, that there has been a lot of advancement, and that is, of course, encouraging for Abliva as well. So are there any specific regulatory benefits that come into play for KL1333?
Yeah. That's a good question, because, I'm going to answer it 2 ways. One, think of it this way. Abliva is tackling primary mitochondrial disease. To think that the national regulatory authorities in the US, the FDA, is willing to accept the premise that Abliva can study a population as broad as that is encompassed by primary mitochondrial disease. That covers a lot of different mitochondrial diseases within that umbrella that's called primary mitochondrial disease. I mean, there are larger primary mitochondria, like MELAS and Lee's disease, but primary mitochondrial disease is a very broad topic. Think of it this way. What if you were going to go to the EMA or the FDA and say, I want to study, primary means genetic. So what if I wanted to study genetic lung disease or genetic heart disease? Would that fly? No way. But the US regulatory system, the FDA, is willing to accommodate Abliva's request that you try to house many different mitochondrial diseases under one umbrella, because they are so rare. There's no way to individually go after each one of these on their own. So the first answer is, with respect to your specific question about Abliva, the very concept that the FDA is willing to accept that Abliva can study something as broad as primary mitochondrial disease is a huge example of how flexible the FDA is in trying to accommodate the needs of patients in Sweden and around the world who have these rare mitochondrial diseases. The second, I said I was going to say 2 things. The second thing I was going to say is, and I don't know whether this can be revealed publicly, so I won't give dates. I have the dates in my head. I won't give dates, but I'll say early this summer, the FDA gave advice to the Abliva, and then the Abliva asked for some clarification. And within less than a month, the FDA came back with great guidance and clarification on that. And to give you an example, Abliva was proposing to do something that's rather traditional, that is, come in with first a study that's going to look at several different doses of their drug and look at it in a short period of time. The FDA, and then do, when the results of that are known, is then to look at a larger, what's called a pivotal registration trial after that. The FDA said, you don't have enough mitochondrial disease patients to afford to do 2 trials. You have to do it all in one trial. That we kind of reject the notion that you are proposing, which is you're proposing taking a lot longer to actually test your therapy for patients with rare diseases by doing it in 2 stages. We are challenging you to do it all in one study. Now, there are some conditions on that, which means the study has to be longer and they have to look at appropriate endpoints. But just think of that. The National Regulatory Authority telling the industry, who has an incentive, obviously, fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, to get things out to patients as soon as possible. And it's telling the industry, you need to do it faster. And here's how you can do it. Now, that's kind of counterintuitive. It's not the way you normally think of how industry works with government, where the government is telling you do it faster, and here's how. So I think that's another example of how the FDA, and I hope the EMA and the Swedish regulatory authorities are all recognizing how important mitochondrial disease is and how they're being accommodating to that.
That's great feedback, and it's a great example of your three-legged chair, I suppose.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being with us, Frank. Thank you.
It's very good to be with you, Charlotte. All the best to all the patients out there with mitochondrial disease. Be strong.
Be strong. Thank you, Frank.